Welcome to State the Obvious. I've traveled through dimensions, communed with otherworldly beings, visited different time periods, read various book articles, magazines, articles, and minds, had psychic talks with mystics, unlocked info stored in my genetics, studied nature, sat under trees, listened to rivers, talked with birds, been stung by bees and other animals, all to bring this information. Welcome to State the Obvious with surveillance.
Welcome to another installment of State the Obvious with surveillance. Welcome. Last installment, previous episode, because you might, watch these on your own time or encounter these on your own time, so I may not be too time specific. But last time we went over a couple introductory things, and I listened to my own self speak, and I had to go back and think, okay, why is it obvious? What makes something obvious? You know what I mean? That's a important thing, I think, to establish for a show like this. Like, what state the obvious, right? So what makes something obvious is that you have a level of information, expertise, or insight into a topic or a field that somebody else doesn't have. So, it's obvious to you. It's not obvious to them because you have information that they don't have. But delving into that a little bit deeper, I, came across a couple other, obvious things. But yeah, so there's multiple ways to look at one thing. Obvious, right? You got two eyes. If you close one of them, you're gonna see just the same view that's in front of you differently, right? So that can, and not to be too ableist, I'm going to be using a lot of visual metaphors for this installment. And so no offense to my blind folks, and if there's a way, I'll look into ways to communicate things that are not so visual dependent or that are considerate of other perspectives. But I'm speaking from my perspective, which is another obvious thing. We see things from our perspective, and we speak from our perspective and our experience, right? And that's what allows certain things to be obvious to us or not. But in thinking about it, I realized, So speaking of visuals, I study film in school. I do graphic design. I work in, different graphic design programs. And I work with cameras, right? So there's a lot of my experience that is centered around visuals, you know what I mean? And visuals in the way I see things, the way other people see things, creating things in the interest of people seeing it a certain way or conveying information through visuals. So that's one of the metaphors I'm going to be using today. And like I said, with the eyes, right? We have two eyes, right? So each of them has a field of view, and when those fields of view come together and are composited in our brain, that creates more depth of field. You know what I mean? You get depth of field, you get different elements of perspective that enhance your understanding, spatial awareness, right? So that's really what it is. All of our senses are awareness. You know what I mean? They're awareness modules or senses or whatever. So, we're sending out a signal or receiving signals through our senses that allow us to have awareness of what's going on around us. And the broader our senses or the far reaching our senses are, expands our sense of the world, you know what I mean? Or expands our sense of the universe around us and what's there, right? So what can we hear? How far can we hear it? Different sounds come from different places. They spark different thoughts, different ideas, smells, tastes, all of that, right? But so going back to, why is it obvious? To me, that metaphor of two eyes applies heavily to why things become obvious, because when you have information, expertise, or insight into different fields, like more than one field, right? And when you put those things together, the convergence of those ideas adds depth to your understanding, just like it adds visual depth for the eyes. Um, or that's one of the ways I see it. So, the convergence of multiple fields of awareness, multiple fields of view, fields of insight, adds clarity and allows things to be obvious. um, so, in furthering that idea, right? Um, Back to the thought that there are multiple ways to look at things, right? And so, leaning on my experience and visuals, I was thinking about like different visual ways that the color wheel or color swatches or the spectrum, visual spectrum, is presented right in programs. So when you're in a graphics application and you're adjusting colors, you got the color picker. Whether you're on Instagram, you see the color picker. A lot of different programs, and especially now that people have smartphones and are editing their own photos, there's a lot of I think just kind of like a tactile experience. Well, tactile might not be the specific word again as feeling, but it feels kind of more tangible if people understand that the way they see things through their eyes and the way that the camera on the phone picks up the same scene is different, right? So that just goes to show you that different people have different perspectives, and it's very easy to have a different view of the same situation or the quote unquote same circumstances, right? But in adjusting that, right? So in adjusting that to convey something, so you take a photo, you put a filter on it, you adjust the brightness and the contrast, you might adjust the color settings or whatever, because you're trying to convey an emotion of maybe how you saw the situation or how you felt during the situation and not just what those circumstances were. And in that editing process, you can see that there are different ways to display a color picker. And sometimes it's like a circular or a radial gradient. Most of the things that we um, create, especially with technology, have a square frame. But it's a radial gradient that goes from, the Roy G. Biv of the spectrum, and you know what I mean, right? And then the other way of looking at it is just kind of linearly, right? So you got the reds on one end and it stretches to the other end. You got, violet on the other side. But so the difference between those ways of viewing the same thing shows that one is kind of polar, right? It's got one color on one end and the opposite color on the other end. The radial view shows that the violet and the reds, they bring them together, right? And it actually creates kind of a smooth, at least visually, is a smooth way of looking at it. And then there's other ways, especially if you're into graphics programs, you're gonna see that there are different ways to present colors, and whether you're painting with light or painting with pigments, actual paint, um, the concepts are different, right? So that's again, multiple ways to see things. And shout out to people who design printers, right? I was thinking about that too. Like, it's a piece of technology, these screens that we use and printers that we use. Um, it's not solid color. There are pixels and dots that are hued at different saturations, levels, and tones to create what we experience as the image. You know what I mean? So if you're into studying color, and then you're gonna know that, okay, there's CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, black. There's RGB, which is red, green, blue. And these are different ways of describing colors. Yeah. So I was inspired to look up these things. So back to the spectrum, right? So I'm looking at the spectrum and I'm seeing the polar way of describing it, right? The red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? But we know that there are so many tones in between those, but that's what we have established as the easy way to separate those colors. You know what I mean? Like, what is this? Dark red, navy red, maroon, burgundy. You know what I'm saying? Red, orange, blood orange. You know what I mean? Like yellow, golden yellow, orange is yellow. You know, so if it's the Crayola box, you got the 8 color, the 16 color, the 24 pack, the I think it's what is it, 256 or 228 in the other pack, whatever, right? And they've got all these names and colors. Pantone system has its own. The lab system is really, really interesting because, I was looking it up to see like, how are these, and online you got hexadecimal color descriptions. Anyway, I'm going deep into it, and that's not where I'm trying to go. I'm trying to stay at the obvious, right? The obvious is that there are multiple ways to describe these things, and the other obvious thing is that when you describe things as polar, the things that you make seem to be opposite, when you look at them a different way, like the color gradient, those things are not opposite. They're actually right next to each other, right? So that's, something that I find to be a useful awareness, right? Useful awareness to apply in my life, right? So in that, I was looking up, uh, the close relationship of passion and zealousy or zealousness or being a zealot, right? And so I, inspired to look up those words. The first time I encountered the word zealot was when I was young. I was reading a book called The Silver Chalice, right? Silver Chalice is the adventure of this young man named Basil. He's trying to design a box. Well, he's been commissioned to design a box that's going to hold the cup from the Last Supper, right? The cup that Jesus Christ and his disciples drank from at the Last Supper is the silver chalice, and he's been, commissioned to design a box. And he wants to carve. I think it's been a long time since I read it, so I had to look it up. And the synopsis, it says he's looking for the disciples so that he can carve their likenesses into the box. Um, and he goes through all of this stuff as a result. And this is the first time I encountered the word zealot, so I was reminded of it in looking up the words. You know, like what is a zealot, right? And besides being besides being a person who is uh, uh, fervent about their ideas, you know what I mean? It has some religious context in its origins, right? Which makes sense that it would be in the book, The Silver Chalice, etc. But it had connotations towards like early Jewish folks that were, resisting the oppression that they were in, right? And when you look up passion, right? Passion, which is viewed as kind of like, in my eyes, it's a word that, is ubiquitous with kind of like a positive fervor. You know what I mean? That you can apply to your life or apply to a situation, right? So that those are words that I would put on the spectrum as being really kind of close together when you look at them from a gradient view of, you know, what's the qualities that are ascribed, or what are the qualities that these words are describing, versus when you put them on the spectrum, they become opposites, right? Because when you look up passion, it wasn't until like maybe the fourth or fifth definition that it got to be, emotional intensity, right? All of the first definitions that I went in the dictionary referred to the passion of Christ and the suffering of Christ in crucifixion, right? So on the one hand, you got this Christian, heavy ideal, and then on the other hand, a Jewish ideal, right? Zealousy and passion. And although their original meanings are not what's most ubiquitous, I think, as far as people's usage of them in, colloquial usage or from day to day when people are talking, that's still there when you look at it from a spectrum point of view, and how, it's just it's interesting to me. And it's interesting, you know that the connotations that we put on words, or that were previously established for words, can sometimes have a carryover effect into, how we interact with the world. um, so, I don't know overseas and in different countries and different languages, if they use if the words that they use for this topic have those same connotations. But it's interesting to me to look at the polarization of ideals, right? And then to come back to the gradient and see, okay, well, those ideals are actually similar, right? So whether it's passion or jealousy, when I look at it nowadays, it would be extremism, right? And if you're talking about political extremism as well, you're talking the far right, the far left, right? So back to my, political discussion from before and ongoing, state the obvious, right? Opposites, kind of, to me, it's like, what's the function of creating an opposite, right? And looking at things through opposites, then you are always engaging with opposition, right? So in looking at things through a gradient, I think that you can, you know, look for harmony, right? Look for harmony. What are the colors that kind of resonate with each other, and what are the ideals that resonate with each other, right? So again, back to extremism. So I'm looking at that, and then I said, okay, well, if passion and jealousy, although looked at um, like opposites, because one is good, one is a good way of being, and one is a bad way of being, and they're actually really close together as far as being intense, right? Those are two intense things, and one is intense opposition, and one is intense um, either sacrifice or an intense investment, right? So, okay. Well, what's the opposite of it? Yeah, I looked up moderate first, and it had a kind of negative connotation as mediocre, or was one of the synonyms, I think. Um, but I didn't have anything that seemed to celebrate the harmony, or celebrate not. You know what I mean? To celebrate that peacefulness, or that peaceful perspective as I see it, right? So that became a question for me too. Like, is that how we look at things in society? Is neutrality, is um, moderation kind of vilified in a way? And um, I think to some extent it is. And that's an opinion. Neutral, having no strongly marked or positive characteristics or features. It just doesn't resonate with inspiration. You know what I mean? That just doesn't resonate with inspiration. So if you're inspired for harmony, what? How can you approach it not through opposition, not through opposing ideals, right? And so that takes a test, right? That takes some experimentation, which brings me back to lab coloring, right? So I looked up the lab coloring, and it was really interesting because it relies on, well, it doesn't, it's not, well, rely. Is that the proper way to describe it? That's how I said it. I'll continue. Um, it uses 3D, a 3D spatial rendering of where the colors are, right? So it uses three axes, like a three-dimensional, like a XYZ, to actually locate a tone and color, and it is said to have infinite possibilities for being able to describe a color. So again, how can we apply a inspiration for harmony, an inspiration for peace, and not be in that negative, polarized view, you know, of red on one end, violet on the other end. When, you know, visually we can experience them in a way that is really smooth. So how can we apply that visual, right? How can we apply that visual understanding to our reality? You know what I'm saying? To our emotional, mental, etc. reality. That's the question, right? So, you know, and I think that in a lot of ways we're asked to pick favorites. You know what I'm saying? Like pick a color. What's your favorite color? You know, and that's okay. You know, it's okay to have a favorite color, I think. Um, but you know, there's a lot of pressure in rivalries. You know what I'm saying? High school rivalries are taught. What's your school colors? You know what I mean? And you know, Thanksgiving game is homecoming, right? Homecoming for who? Right? When you think about the what's happened to Native Americans in this country, and you know, so what is that really a celebration of when your high school plays a rivalry? Like, you know, you learn that your first year in high school. Um, well, this is the team we oppose. You know, every year. Ad nauseum, you know what I'm saying? Like every year, and this has been going on for years and years and years, and this is how we feel about them because we've been in conflict with them forever. They're on the other side of the spectrum, you know. Sometimes it's not always that the school colors are opposite, but just you know, conceptually, these are the kinds of things that we are instilling and reiterating in ourselves and reiterating in our children, reiterating in our in each other is this kind of conflict, and you know, examining not just the surface of, not just the flat layer of how we choose things, but the three-dimensional space and the real space of, you know, what are the positions of these different tones and perspectives that we come from. I think that's important, you know. Back to the idea. Things become obvious to you because expertise or interest or information in a different field gives you a different perspective. People see things in different ways. There are multiple ways to look at the same thing, right? And looking at things through opposites creates opposition in your mind. And the way that we see things in our mind translates into how we experience them into the world or in the world. This is my experience. That's what I'm sharing. The information that I have available, the information in the different fields that I have interest in, is what creates my perspective as well as the position that I'm in. So thanks for joining me again. This is another installment of State the Obvious with Surveillance, brought to you by my orbital observations. Thank you and peace.